Next, from the state capitol, we speak one-on-one with Illinois Representative Tom Cross, the leader of the House Republicans. We hear his thoughts on state spending and why he's critical of Governor Quinn's management of the budget. This runs about 20 minutes. Representative Tom Cross, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
My pleasure.
It seems like the only real issue that anyone's talking about is the financial situation here in the Capitol. So let's just take the big picture. Where we've now heard the governor's budget address, which, first of all, your reaction to what he said and your thoughts on where the state needs to go to get back to being fiscally sound.
Well, we ended up with a pretty deep hole in this state, financially speaking, and that happened because we spent more money than we took in. The former governor did that, along with his colleagues on his side of the aisle. And the problem with the governor's budget is he continues to do that. The budget he introduced increases spending by $1.7 billion. And we continue to have problems, and we will continue to have problems in the state until people realize you can't spend money you don't have, you can't increase spending, and when you do that, you perpetuate the problem, and you will never get out of this hole. It's pretty amazing that the governor and his party increased taxes by 66% on individuals, and then of course an additional tax on corporations. With this spending pattern, we'll see that tax, in my opinion, it get extended year after year because the numbers just don't work because of their spending and in their continuous spending.
When we talk about the new spending, the 1.75, have you determined where that spending is coming from?
Well, we're trying to look through it. Some of it's for increased pension payment. Some of it is in increased Medicaid. Some of it is increased in some programs the governor calls enhancements to existing programs. The other problem with his budget is he spends more money than we're going to take in by about $1.5 billion. You can't do that. And nobody watching your show does that at home. If they do that at home, they end up at a bankruptcy court if they do it for any extended period. And somewhere, someday, sometime, our governor has got to understand we can't spend money we don't have.
You know, here's the thing, I guess, that's somewhat the quandary, and it's at the national level and it's at the state level. And as we tape this, we see our neighbors to the north with Wisconsin and the arguments they're going through trying to get their budget back in balance. So much of these budgets, whether at the federal level or at the state level, are being pushed by what we call the entitlements, the automatic spending. As you mentioned, the pension increase, the Medicaid increase, which is being imposed. To what extent can a governor get a handle on the automatic pilot aspect of spending unless you're going to face down some of these built-in automatic pilot spending programs such as pensions or such as health care?
You're going to need to look at our pension situation in Illinois. Let me back up. None of the discussions that we need to have are pleasant. They're very difficult. Just like at home, when we make decisions to not do things, whether it's with our kids or our spouses, they're often difficult conversations, and no one likes to say no. We don't like saying no at home, we don't like saying no in our businesses, and we don't like saying no in government. So all of these discussions, if we're going to do it, what we need to do, are going to be difficult, they're going to be uncomfortable, they're going to be painful at times. No one wants to do that. So we need to face some of the challenges we have, or we'll just be in this perpetual problem year in, year out. And one of those problems is pensions. As you alluded to, we have an $80 billion unfunded pension liability in the state of Illinois, meaning we don't have enough money to take care of $80 billion in pension obligations. And there are those in the financial markets, independent from the state of Illinois, that will tell you that $80 billion unfunded liability is really higher than that. That the way the state manipulates numbers, that number without those manipulations would be higher. We've got to face that. And the problem we have on that $80 billion unfunded liability is over the next, well, between now and 2045, we in essence have a mortgage we're paying between now and 2045 to get our pension system in the position it needs to be adequately funded from a security standpoint, from a safety standpoint. We have a $4 billion payment plan today, and by 2045 it'll be $22 billion, and it climbs incrementally year in and year out. We can't sustain that. When we have to grow, when that number grows, it means less money to seniors, less money to the developmental, the disability community. So we've got to tackle this unfunded liability of $80 billion. No one wants to do it. We've got our hands cuffed with the Constitution. But if we don't do it, we may not have a pension system. We certainly won't have one in the way we're used to it. I was in the state of Alabama over the Christmas holidays, and there's a town in Alabama called Pritchard, Alabama. They're bankrupt. Their pension system is completely out of money. It's just gone. And while our Constitution says you can't diminish benefits, it says nothing about whether or not the state's a guarantor on a pension system. So in Pritchard, Alabama, those that are retirees that are expecting checks aren't getting anything. And the town says, we don't have the money to do it. And so there's all kinds of litigation. Bottom line is, we've got to tackle pensions, as unpleasant as it is, but to those that are retired now, or going to retire, or soon or later, we have an obligation to protect them and make sure there's a system in place. So one of the worst conversations you're going to want to have, because no one wants to discuss it, but we have to do it. Long answer, I apologize.
No, but it's important that we have, and that's why we have the Illinois Channel, so we can focus for a long time on some of these big issues, and pensions is a complicated, big issue.
Here's why it's complicated, it's emotional, because state employees and teachers have done what they've been asked to do. They haven't done anything wrong in the sense that they're supposed to make a contribution.
Their side of the contract wasn't broken.
Right. There's no question about it. With one caveat, I'll get to in a second. The state hasn't made their payment, and in many instances, and has a lot of the blame to share. All right, and if you're the state employee, you say, wait a minute, you didn't make a payment. I've made my payment. You can't change the rules midstream, and I struggle with that. I think that is a moral issue, an ethical issue, a contractual issue that you have to respect. But on top of that, which adds to our unfunded liability, is the issue of people living longer, okay? So when we set up these systems in the 30s, people died at age 60 or 65, and when they retired, they only lived a few years, and they put in a lot of money, and by the time they died, it all kind of evened out. Now we have people living to 80, 85 years old. So if you do the math on if somebody lives 25 or 30 years into retirement, you take what they get in retirement versus what they put in, there's a huge
disparity between
the two. And in Illinois, we have what's called a COLA, cost of living increase, or cost of living adjustment, that it takes that pension and has it climb every year by 3%, and it compounds. If you do the math, if you retire, if you live for 25 years, you will literally double your pension. So if you get a pension of $50,000 in 25 years, your pension will be $100,000. Not what it's worth, but actually $100,000 because of that compounding of the interest. So the living longer has caused a problem. The other thing and that's not anybody's fault, maybe the medical community, but we live longer. It's the reality of the world. So it's had a factor on a lot. The other thing that's happened, and I think everybody's to blame for the following: the General Assembly is, and state workers and teachers is, we have, and everybody's on both sides has been at fault of this, we have allowed people to enhance their benefits or take advantage of certain factors. So teachers,
so the legislature sweetens the pension plan and it's not funded.
It's not funded. Correct.
And they say, Bob, if you're a fireman, why don't you bring Sally, your wife, on? And if there's been no payments for Sally, you have an immediate unfunded mandate.
Well, and on top of that, when all those pensions, when somebody dies, there's this fiver benefit of 66 and 2/3, so that adds to our woes. But yeah, so a teacher, understandably so, says I have an opportunity to increase my pension at the end of my career. Used to be 20% a year at the end, or 6% now. There ain't been enough money to put in it. And so the General Assembly did that, and the workers said, that's great, I'm going to take advantage of it, which is the American way. But it's added to this big unfunded liability. And everybody, whether it was not making the pension payment, or people living longer, or sweeteners, we all just said, oh, we'll get to it a different day. Don't worry about it. Well, we're here.
One thing I want to go back to when you're, I think a lot of people, my sense is, are so fed up that they say, okay, we get it. We get it in the big scheme. Maybe we don't know all the details. But what are you guys going to do about it? You, the legislature. And they want you to work together, right?
Yeah.
They say, look, we understand it's not going to be just the Republicans doing it. You got to have both sides.
It's so bad when you...
And I don't mean to beat you on the head here, but when we say, criticize the governor, as you just said, for spending $1.75 billion more, on one hand, is that a fair criticism when we say, look, it's really part of that budget that's driving an automatic pilot. It's these pension increases. It's the Medicaid that the feds are telling us to do. We got to deal with it, but I don't know if it's not like the governor's going out and spending $1.75 billion on building new parks or discretionary spending. So
well, of that $1.7 billion, maybe half of it is attributable to the Medicaid and the pensions. The other part of it's
discretionary. Okay.
Enhancing, but wouldn't you, again, at home, and it's not simple, as I said earlier, you go somewhere else in that budget that's $33 billion and cut out, you know, if I have to raise it because of Medicaid and pension because the federal government tells me or because the General Assembly over the last 40 years messed up the pension system, I realize I have to up it by $700 million. So let me go somewhere else and cut $700 million. Didn't seem to be any effort to do that.
The governor has said or made claims that have been somewhat challenged that he's cut spending out of the budget. Do you agree with the governor that he's made the cuts? And when you are working on this year's budget that's being prepared as we sit here during the spring session, what are your thoughts on how that's going to come together? Two
parts to your question. One, the governor touted that he had cut $3 billion the last 2 years. Anybody within the budget process or within this building knows, unfortunately, there's very little truth to that. And even the governor's budget people, when you get them on one-on-one, will admit that number's inflated in such a big way. So what he has done in that $3 billion number is he has just shifted some of those liabilities into a different pot. And in many instances, they haven't been paid. Some Medicaid bills, some group insurance bills that total about $2.5 billion. They haven't been paid. It hasn't, and he hasn't eliminated the liability. He's going to pay them. He just doesn't have them in the liability column. He's shifted them over here, so he says we don't have. So unfortunately, his touting and claim to cuts is fallen on deaf ears because it's just simply not true.
The Republican caucus has been critical of the tax increase that passed in lame duck session, literally in the last day of the last session, last legislature, I should say. On the other hand, there were tax caps, spending caps, I should say, put in to that bill, that the tax increase will be undone and revert back to the previous level if those spending levels are exceeded. What are your thoughts on those spending caps?
The numbers don't work. It was again, it was designed to give the appearance that they get it in terms of capping spending. The reality is between now and the next 4 years, that spending, that tax bill allows for growth to the tune of about 17%. So we're at $33 billion. In 4 years, we would allow the governor to spend up to $39 billion.
Doesn't there have to be an increase relative, again, to the automatic spending increases of pensions and others?
You can cut in other places. So, I mean, at home, if I have an increased grocery bill because I have a couple more kids, I'm going to have to go find someplace else to cut. And that's the reality. That's the problem with this governor and his party, and that they've not been willing to sit down and make those sacrifices of cuts somewhere else.
Let's go to what's happening in other states. In your estimation, should we, going back to the pensions, take a look and say, let's cut the pension benefits going forward? Now, you changed the system last year. You lowered basically the benefit structure for new hires that start this year. But for those who are already working, and I know this is a legal issue, a question of whether it can be done, it seems like Speaker Madigan has opened the door on maybe looking at that issue. In your estimation, can we do it, and should we do it?
I don't think we have a choice. Again, one of those tough conversations, and as I explained earlier, there are a lot of components, and it's very emotional, and there's a fairness and an equity issue. But I think there's a fairness and equity issue to the future retiree and the retiree to make sure we actually have a stable pension system, which we don't have. We do not have a stable, viable pension system. We've introduced a bill that outlines some ways going forward to reduce that unfunded liability by as much as $25 to $30 billion. And I'm glad that the Speaker's open to that. We have a bill, as I said, and he said he's willing to talk about it. We've got to do it. Again, if you do the math, somebody may end up over the life of a career, put in $200,000, where in reality, not in reality, when they retire and live 25 or 30 years, they may end up with $1.5 billion to $2 billion because of that COLA. The numbers just don't work. So If we want a system long-term, we're going to have to address this, and to put our head in the sands is a huge mistake.
I'm going to rephrase, I think, what you already said, but let me just, in essence, you need to have the workers who would perhaps be protesting with cuts as they might be, as they are in Wisconsin. But in essence, you would have workers understand that if we don't adjust the pension system, it's going to be like that town in Alabama where you may have benefits on paper, but there's just not going to be any dollars.
I don't think there's any question. That's a reality that we have to face. And if you talk to anybody that's a numbers person that looks at Illinois, you know, we're 30 to 35, maybe 37, 38% funded in these systems, where in the private sector we demand that they be funded at 75, well, 80 to 90%. That stability. And we just don't have the stability and the sustainability based on the numbers and obligations we have because of all the things I talked about for this thing to be viable. And again, you know, if I'm a worker, I'm going to be angry about this conversation because I don't want to have it, because I've lived by the rules. But people before them have gamed the system. They've taken advantage of sweeteners. They've taken advantage of a variety of things. They've lived longer. The General Assembly's at fault. All that's happened. But if we don't have it, we put our heads in the sand, you're going to wake up in 20 years or 10 years or 25 and say, wow, where's my pension system? You
know, one of the other aspects of the governor's budget is to borrow $8.75 billion to get caught up somewhat on some of the bills being that are languishing out there. And you got a lot of businesses, people who've extended credit to the state. I've heard stories of you have pharmacists who are mortgaging their homes just to keep their pharmacies open. Should we do that, and don't we have an obligation to pay the bills in a timely manner?
Well, we have to pay our bills. But the governor wanted to borrow $9 billion. Now, this is a governor that just passed a tax increase with his party of over $7 billion. This is a governor that just borrowed, at the end of the year, $3.7 billion. He wants to borrow 8.7, so that's giving a governor $20 billion. And then he wants to pay it back in what we call backloading. He doesn't pay back that 8.7 quickly. He barely pays it back at the outset and pays more of that $8 billion down the road over 14 years, where the higher amounts come in at the end. It means that we pay $4 billion in interest. $4 billion in interest.
Over what period of time?
Over 14 years. So we have concerns about the size and the structure. But what you're doing by borrowing in many ways is kicking the proverbial can down the road. You've got to address the pension issue. We've got a retiree health care issue of an unfunded liability of about $40 billion. We've got a governor that hasn't been willing to cut, nor have most of the people in his party. So for us to perpetuate this problem by seeing a tax increase at 66%, borrowing in January of 3.7, and then to give them another $9 billion without making any sacrifices, Governor, is what I think troubles many of us, and I think even on both sides of the aisle.
What do you make, though, when the governor would say, look, you're already borrowing and you're actually paying a higher interest rate because you're borrowing from these businessmen, and the state has to pay, as I understand it, 12% to those that they owe, whereas given the current market, we could borrow at 5% or so.
I'd say, Governor, why don't we go to the root of our problems? What are you going to do about pensions, Governor? What are you going to do about retiree health care, Governor? What are you going to do about cutting the budget, Governor, so we don't perpetuate this problem? We are the first to say, and we have said it, we want to pay our bills. But if we don't address these underlying root problems, then we will always be talking about taxes being raised, borrowing continuing, and we never address the underlying fundamental problems, and he has yet to do that. And the question really is back to him. When are you going to address the real ones, Governor?
We don't have a whole lot of time, but where do we stand right now with the governor? I mean, are we just at odds? Is this a political tug-of-war?
No.
Or is there groundbreaking where you're talking with Speaker Madigan, you're talking with John Cullerton, you're talking with the governor? Is there any firm, substantive conversations being had on these issues?
Let our positions be known. And actually, as I said, there's some Democrats that share our concerns. And we've been meeting with the governor, we've also additionally, without the governor, been meeting with the Speaker and the President and Christine Radogno, and I think that's healthy. It's better than we've been doing around here. And these are huge problems that not one party or one person can solve. So it's going to take all the Democrats and Republicans coming together and making some very, very difficult decisions, whether it's on pensions or cuts or on a variety of reforms, and I'm hopeful that that will happen sooner than later.
Will it happen this spring?
Oh, it's got to. It's got to. We have no choice.
One last question. As we tape this yesterday, you appeared before the House Education Committee and had a bill. So we'll have one question that doesn't deal with the budget, but there are other things you addressed.
Sure.
Your bill was on concussions relative to football players predominantly, not necessarily just football players, but in sports. Just tell us briefly, A, what does that bill do? And B, to what extent is it proper for the legislature to be mandating that schools teach certain things?
This basically deals with high school athletics and sports and all, really, at all levels. And it's all contact sports. It could be volleyball, it could be basketball, it could be football, it could be soccer. And we did our best we're very respectful of the mandate issue and what it does to local schools. So what we partnered with the IHSA, and Marty Hickman was here, the head of the IHSA, and did a great job. Kurt Becker was here, former Bears player from the NFL on the '85 Bears, coaching high school football now. And what we're trying to do is create awareness for both students, parents, and those at the school, trainers and coaches, about concussions, when you have one, how you should handle it. So the IHSA has that material all available, and we will funnel it down, so to speak, to parents and kids and coaches and trainers to make sure people know what to look for, how to handle the situation, and that's the important thing. So there's not a cost to the local school district because they can access all that information from the IHSA, but it's awareness day, and I think we're finding out now around the country the significance of what happens to seemingly primarily football players and some of the tragedies that have happened with them, and that if you don't watch out for them, and if you put a young man or woman back into a game when they've had one, you can do permanent irreparable harm. So it's an awareness and education bill right now, and I'm working with Senator Raul, a Democrat in the Senate, and we're trying to have bipartisanship on this, and we will, and I think we'll have a successful product at the end of the day.
House Republican Leader Tom Cross, we know you're always busy. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
And thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.